Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining this session on cross-border, small-scale cross-border trade, corruption, and COVID. I'm Jackie Klopp, and I am a researcher at the Earth Institute at Columbia University and working on a project with the Anti-Corruption Evidence Program of Global Integrity, looking at exactly these issues of small-scale cross-border trade, corruption, harassment. And now, because of events, we're also considering the impacts of COVID, which have been, as you'll see, quite extensive, including on corruption, which is part of what we want to talk about today. I have some wonderful colleagues with me who will introduce themselves shortly. I just want to let everyone know that this will be recorded. And, if you have any questions as we go along, we'd love for you to ask those. For now, if you could put those in the chat as we go along, that would be great. And we will have a question and answer period. So we hopefully we have a small enough group, we can have a discussion. And with that, I will now invite you to listen to some women traders from the Kenyan border at Busia on what they're facing right now. Ambika?
Shida iko I started my business in 2018. At that time I was very down. I didn't know what to do. But when I started this business, I was able to put food on the table. And this business makes me to pay school fees for my kids. I'm independent. I run my business on my own. And right now I have money. At least there is something in my pocket. Shida iko nalipa point mbili. Point ya Uganda na ya Kenya. Hiyo tunalipa. Alafu hiyo license tunakata ya mwaka mzima. That you want to do to be in business, it will force you to bribe because the border is closed. So you have to use that non-gazetted route to get what you want. Most of the ladies need more sensitization. They need to know their rights. They need to be trained, and so that they use OSPP, one-stop border post. Because others are using it through ignorance. Others are using it because they lack knowledge of using border procedures.
Just trying to cross border using OSPP, I myself, but my fellow women can't cross. But myself, I try to follow the rules and regulations about to get COVID certificate, free COVID certificate. But do you know the problem is challenges, but because government came with the rules, we are supposed to pay $60, which small scale trader cannot afford.
Through those non-gazetted rules, if you are not able to bribe, they can end up to get sexual harassment from security officers from both sides.
So many women, they are using forest routes because the regulations and rules of government doesn't allow them to pass at the OSPP, one-stop border post. But before Corona, COVID-19 came, we have been using one-stop border post because we have already sensitized and we know our rights and we know the regulations and rules of customs. But right now, rules were going to be about the COVID-19. That is make so many women to go back to the bush. So they are facing so many challenges, harassment and sexual harassment and theft, gender-based violence with the security officer.
Sasa unajua zamani tulikuwa tunanuanga machunga gunia 1,500, 2,500 the highest. Lakini vile COVID iliingia tumeinunuanga kwa 3,000, hiyo the lowest price. Price ya juu sana 4,500. Hiyo ndiyo iliaffect sisi sana, kwa sababu sasa hata ukinunua hiyo bei ukipelekea mtu kuuza.
Yeah, even now it has not been announced officially that the border is open. So most of the people, they don't know if it is open or not.
Kuja unisaidie. Enda alafu kuje. Itufundishia watu wa kupita mpaka. Wakisa tufundisha watu wa kupita mpaka. Tusiwe tunatumia pesa nyingi kwa kupita. Alafu nilikuwa naomba serikali pia kama inaweza, kama sisi wa mama wa biashara, inaweza kutuangalilia ni vipi tunaweza kupata pesa so that tuongeze kwa capital zetu, iwe rahisi kufanya biashara kama wamama.
Because if you can access OCDP freely with 100 bags of maize, and yet you are using the non-gazetted route from Uganda, and then you pay almost 300 to pass, that is what I can describe as corruption.
Pahali government wote wanafanya. They are very big corruption people. More corruption. Hata pesa mingi hao watu wamepata kwa corruption. Hawajali kwa mtu mdogo, tena hawajali kwa ugonjwa hiyo. Ugonjwa wanasema tu lakini hawasaidii.
If I can advise the government, one, they should put there a desk for women, trade information desk, so that women must have knowledge on trading or where to run to. Agenda desk for women at the customs, and do more sensitization on cross-border trade, especially in East Africa.
Great, thank you so much, Ambika. We thought it important to start this session with the voices of the traders themselves, and you can see that COVID restrictions meant to protect public health have led to some unintended consequences. Now, I'm going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about how their work relates to what we just saw. And then we're going to have a conversation that builds on what Edna, Emily, Jane, Florence, and Lenny just talked about in the video. We'll start with you, David.
Thank you so much, Jackie, for having me. I'm David Orega, and I work for Sauti Africa. So at Sauti, what we do is we leverage mobile technology to deliver trade and market information to small-scale cross-border traders. And most importantly, we also give them a platform through which they can report incidences of harassment and corruption at the border. Thank you.
Great. Eleanor?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for having me on this panel. This is really exciting. I'm a researcher, PhD student at UC Berkeley. My research focuses on small-scale border trade, and more specifically, actually, on the interdependencies between informal and formal trade channels, or trade border crossings. And so I'm particularly interested in understanding how information can increase bargaining power for these traders and reduce the costs and bribes that they face when crossing the border. And for over a year now, throughout the pandemic, I've carried out quite a large data collection project and followed small-scale traders in Kenya just throughout the pandemic. And it's been fascinating to see how they have had to adapt their business and trade routes when they are faced with restrictions such as the closure of the border, as we've seen in the video. I've also been able to kind of look at the behavior changes on the other side, on the side of the border agents, and how they responded by targeting more informal crossings and increasing bribes.
Thank you. And Lorna?
Hi, everyone. So happy to be here and thank you for having me. So my name is Lorna Wahome. I'm a research manager at the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics in Nairobi, Kenya. We are an organization that works to advance and apply behavioral science in pursuit of poverty alleviation. So I'm currently working actually on a year-long project that's been taking place with Jackie, our host, a project called the ACE project that seeks to understand how COVID-19 has impacted small-scale cross-border trade at the Uganda and Kenya border in Busia, as well as the Tanzania and Kenya border in Taveta. So specifically, we're looking at how corruption has evolved at the border during this pandemic, and also how trader behavior has also adopted at this time. Thank you.
Wonderful. So I'm going to ask each of you to speak a little bit about how the border works for people who may not know that in terms of these one-stop border posts that were mentioned, which was a reform or is an ongoing reform linked to addressing long waiting times and also corruption. So this tends to be the focus of a lot of anti-corruption effort, is really kind of fixing the formal border. And I'm wondering how well that is working, since the traders mentioned it multiple times, in your view. And then maybe we'll take a look at what's happened really when the COVID restrictions hit that formal border. And you know, any one of you can jump in, but maybe I'll start with David. Do you want to talk a little bit about the one-stop border post as a kind of anti-corruption approach?
Yeah, so at the one-stop border post, ideally how it's been programmed, it's in a way that if you're clearing for your goods, for example, you don't need to go through all those borders. So in the first case, for example, if you're coming from Kenya and your destination is Uganda, you go straight to the Ugandan part of the border to have your goods cleared. But then in the process, you have to interact with a lot of agencies. For example, you can have, for example, phytosanitary agencies, you can have Bureau of Standards, you can also have the revenue authorities. And the entity that stands most accused is the security agency as far as corruption is concerned. So when you get to the border, because obviously there are stipulated procedures that needs to be followed, and because maybe some of these traders, a lot of them maybe might not have a better understanding of what those procedures are, they kind of shy off from using those official or other gazetted border points. And then when COVID-19 came in, and we of course added restrictions and conditions for crossing the formal border, a lot of these women now resorted to using the informal border crossings, which they confidently refer to as the panels. So as it is at the moment, there's just been an increased number of incidences where a lot of them, instead of using the official or the gazetted border, they instead use the panels.
Thank you. That was really helpful. I'm going to ask Eleanor and Lorna to talk a little bit about what's happened with the COVID restrictions that the women talked about. They talked about the fact that the border got closed and then it was open. There was very poor communication. And then on top of it, there was at one point the border was opened, but you had to have a COVID certificate, which costs a lot for a small scale trader. And keep in mind, these small scale traders are primarily women, and they're so important to their communities and to food security in the region. So it seems like these COVID restrictions were sort of put on the one-stop border post, and you know, you've had these consequences that are very problematic from a public health point of view and for these traders and their communities. So I would like maybe Eleanor to talk a little bit about what those restrictions were and their impacts, and then Lorna, maybe you can follow up with comments, because our research is very complementary.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting. I think in the past few years, there's been a push to try and formalize trade and try and reassure, you know, as David was saying, that these cross-border traders didn't have to go through the informal routes that may be more dangerous and could actually go through the formal routes, the official border crossings. And then COVID hit and the border was closed for like at least a significant amount of time. And as you say, like it did open up a few months after, but the cost, like the requirements required to cross the border for these small scale traders were really high. So they needed a COVID certificate and it was really expensive. So it ended up being a complete closure of the border for a really long time for these small scale traders. And so, I mean, when you think about it, it's like, you know, the whole supply chain has been completely disrupted. They can't go and buy their supplies anymore. And so it's a complete shift in their business. And we do see that in the data that I've collected. A lot of these traders have had to switch and become domestic traders. So have to like source their inputs, you know, from Kenya rather than having to go to Uganda and coming back. We see like a huge, a significant decrease in sales and profits, specifically for women, actually, interestingly. And then the other thing that we see is those who do continue to want to go across the border to source their products have shifted to the informal border. So after all this work to try and shift them to the formal sector, they've like shifted back to going back to informal border crossings, which makes sense because that's where they go. As you can imagine, there's, you know, historically, the police and other border agents have known to position themselves on the informal border crossings to be able to collect bribes, and obviously with a higher, you know, more women crossing the informal way, we also see an increase in corruption and the amount of bribes because they know that they can extract more, given that's their only option to cross the border.
Yeah, and there may be a danger that that might be sticky, right? In terms of once the border opens again, you've now really, a lot of women are now still using those Panya routes. So it'll be interesting to see what happens as COVID decreases, and hopefully soon, and the border becomes more like it used to be. Yeah, Lorna, thank you. That was fantastic. Lorna, did you want to comment as well on some of what you were finding?
Yes, absolutely. I think I concur with what Eleanor and David are saying, and it's some of the same things that we're seeing in our research. So even from the onset, when we started our study, Jackie, last year, we had many of our small scale traders saying that they were still using the Tanya routes, right? So the use of Tanya routes has always been there just because there's such a high opportunity cost for small scale traders to pass through the formal routes. And then now with COVID, what we're seeing on the Busia side and the Taveta side is that just the addition of more documentation. So previously traders had to maybe show a yellow fever card, they had to show passport, invoice for their goods. That now with COVID-19, there is just additional documentation that they have to show, which is the certificate, which is also very costly. So we find that now pushes traders to use the Tanya routes. And as Eleanor has said, this not only causes, a public health concern, just because these traders, they are not, no one is subjecting them to any testing, no one is even checking on their health. And then it also subjects them to more corruption and safety, issues of safety. So even some of the traders that we've talked to, it's quite interesting on the Taveta side, because I think also it's interesting to see how regulations are different across the two borders, on the Busia side and on the Taveta side. So one of the traders, that we talked to a few weeks ago said, nowadays traders have to give something small, kitu kidogo, so that at least you can get a certificate. It's not an official certificate, that if they're crossing through the formal route, give something small so that you can be able to be allowed to go through. So over the last few months, we've seen that, the pandemic has really heightened and has really, magnified corruption and has shown it for its worst, especially during this pandemic.
Yeah, and it seems that both the study we're involved in and Eleanor's study is showing that corruption has increased. There is a widespread perception that people are paying more. And as Eleanor said, you also see these border officials being quite adaptive. So as more people are using the Panya routes, the police particularly their mobile, can extract more. So we see how these corrupt actors are actually quite resilient. And when you have these kinds of shocks to the system, find ways to extract more from people who are particularly vulnerable. And we've also seen, I want to emphasize that this raises other public health issues like gender-based violence. And I wonder if each one of you wants to talk a little bit about the gender dynamics. There are many men who are small-scale traders too, but it seems like the staffing of the security officials and the staffing at the one-stop border post is primarily male, and you have these predominant, predominant women traders, and it creates a really problematic gender dynamic. I don't know if, well, I should just open it up. Who would like to maybe speak a bit to the gender issues and the sexual violence?
Yeah, so maybe if I can go first, we've had numerous reports of women mostly being raped whenever they're using like the panya routes, because when talking about these panya routes, for sure, issues around security are never considered, and ideally, a lot of these panya routes are just like bushes. And they have to go through long tracks to get to their destinations. Additionally, apart from maybe the security agencies, some of the people that they use as transporters, probably to help them to smuggle the goods. On many occasions, again, we've heard that these people have turned against them, and raped them, and in some situations as well, we've also heard that maybe the women are not able to afford the bribes that are being solicited from them. And maybe in that case, the other option they have, and the way they put it is like they offer whatever they can at that point in time, which is like their body. So in these panels, for sure, like a lot of the frustrations that these women face, apparently trying to avoid them at the official crossings. In these panels now, this problem seems to be doubled up, and a lot of the times it goes around sexual harassment. And their rights basically being violated.
Yeah, it's very disconcerting. Yeah, Eleanor, go ahead, please jump in.
Just to that, Jackie, I agree with everything that David had said. We even had a particular incident where traders, at least on the Taveta side, would report that they fear getting arrested. So especially the women traders, they fear getting arrested because, once they get into those cells, as opposed to their male counterparts, if let's say they're lacking some documentation, they can be, if they are arrested, they can be able to pay off something small and then they'll get off arrest. That women really voiced, and they said, we are fearful getting arrested because we don't know what is going to happen to us. And then another important thing that came up in our study is that there's not a lot of female police officers. So even if you do have an issue, most of the people you're interacting with as a small scale female trader are male officials. And you're at a significant disadvantage, especially when they notice that you don't know your rights as a trader, when you don't have information on documentation, when you don't have, as David mentioned, even the fees to pay at the border, then you are at a particular disadvantage. So these are some of the things that we've been seeing, and it's really, really very, very difficult for traders. And even when they do use the Tanya routes, as David had mentioned, there's threats of sexual harassment and even confiscated goods. So those that maybe cannot pay and those that are not subjected to sexual harassment also get their goods stolen. And this has come up several times in some of the testimonies that we've heard from our traders.
Yeah, and it speaks to how important this trade is to their livelihoods, that they would be willing to risk so much. And David, I remember you were saying once also, I mean, somebody even drowned at one point from using one of these routes as well. So it's just, yeah, it's very, very disconcerting. And it does seem to suggest that the one-stop border post, especially in this time of COVID, is a problem. It's supposed to be an anti-corruption and trade facilitating mechanism, but there are still obviously things that are not working there. So I think in terms of our anti-corruption research, maybe we need to think about how we need to go further in transforming that border. which I'm going to ask everyone about next in terms of like what are some of the steps to move forward on this, and what other things do we need to pay attention to with our research for our advocacy for these small scale traders. But I'd like Eleanor maybe to talk a bit about her finding that women tend to pay more bribes on average than men per unit of what they're trading. Eleanor, did you want to speak to that point? Because I also think that's a very important gender dynamic we need to understand.
Yeah, so yeah, we do actually find that women pay more bribes than men. And I think like the main two reasons, and there's potentially others, but the main two is one, just, I think Lorna mentioned, I think that kind of, bargaining power at the border when you're like discussing bribes is like very different when it's a woman trader and a man, border agent, compared to if it was two men. And so I think women tend to have a lower bargaining power, which ends up in like having to pay higher bribes. So I think like that like kind of gender relationship is like really crucial in this situation. The other part is that women traders tend to trade, be smaller traders, so trade less in values. And some of these bribes are kind of fixed costs. So if you want to cross the border, you have to pay X. And obviously per, value of what you're transporting, it's a lot higher for women. I think those are two big channels that, explain why we do see a higher level of bribes for women. And I should say that's true before the pandemic, but the change, like it's even more true given what has happened in the past few months.
Yeah, no, that's really important, which again just points to the centrality of addressing some of this gender dynamic as a whole. And I'm wondering, David, I know you've been looking at the One Stop Border Post and really trying to support efforts to improve it. How well are we doing with that in terms of reducing the costs for traders at this border? Obviously, we've seen with COVID that the costs escalated, and that caused some of the traders to move towards informality. But how are we doing generally? Can we talk a little bit more about the One Stop Border Post and the reforms going on there? Edna, I think, talked about, well, we need a gender desk, we need a trade information desk, which I believe exists. But what can we do at the formal border, even now, right, with COVID, to fix some of these problems?
Well, so generally, there's been some significant progress in making the one-stop border post ideally to be women-friendly. And even if you're looking at the physical facilities that have been constructed, to be fair to the authorities, they've done some magnificent job. However, there's still some areas that they're struggling with, and especially COVID-19, I guess, has just exposed that a lot. For example, when COVID started, and there were some traders who were allowed somehow to cross the border, maybe the truckers, for example. But then you'll find that maybe a COVID-19 negative test in Kenya would not be accepted on the Ugandan side. So ideally, it would be proper for these agencies also to harmonize maybe their testing so that when something is done on the Kenyan side, it doesn't need to be redone again on the other country. And then in terms of taxes, again, there's been an attempt to harmonize and make this information publicly available to the traders. But then, of course, due to challenges around technology and the platforms that they're using to disseminate this information hardly gets to the traders. That is why there have been some initiatives like Sauti's initiative just to complement the government activities of disseminating this information to traders. But by and large, just to ensure that maybe a lot more of these traders are moved from the informal crossing to the formal one, I think there's need for a lot of sensitization on the side of the traders, at least to make them more aware about their obligations and also their rights as the citizens of the community. And I think this is something that we've been struggling with as a region. Like the information mostly target the big boys in business, but women mostly, they kind of find themselves disadvantaged that maybe the platforms that are being used really are not conducive for them. But to be fair again, I think there's some significant progress in terms of making the border to be friendly to women. But then obviously there needs to be a bit more that needs to be done.
Yeah. And also in terms of staffing, I think we're a lot of the border officials are men. Is that not correct? And I'm just wondering if some of the sexual harassment and is still happening at the one-stop border post, or whether you feel that because it's like a kind of an open system, which is part of its design, that there's a little less of that because you actually, there's all these eyes on people crossing the border. Or is it a problem for the formal border as well?
Crossing the border is take advantage of or the traders.
Oh, I think David is raising.
In a bit, or sorry, can you hear me?
I think you're frozen. Sorry, but now I can.
Okay. Yeah, so as I mentioned, what's happening is like women are more vulnerable, and especially the small scale cross-border traders, they're more vulnerable to sexual harassment because a lot of the times they
I think we have some internet problem.
and
Sorry, David, I think unless it's just my connectivity, you were frozen for a little bit.
And now it's good.
yeah. Am I on?
Yes. Yeah, to be expected in our Zoom world.
Sorry, I guess I'm facing a bit of internet fluctuations. Yeah, so that mentioning, women are a lot more vulnerable to sexual harassment because from the studies that we've done, we do realize that a lot of them actually are the people who don't have access to the requisite information. So the fact that they don't understand a lot of the procedures that needs to be followed, and by essence, them breaking the law, and maybe they don't have adequate funding or finances to pay bribes, they always offer to like pay it in kind using their body. So ideally, yes, again, because a lot of the people, officials at the borders are men, then it's kind of, it looks like maybe that's the right thing for them to do because they don't have a choice, they don't have the money, and they have also seen for sure that they've flouted the rules.
I see. So one effort to make is to actually have more women actually working at the one-stop border post. It would perhaps create a little bit of a different environment. So again, gender solutions are really important here. Yeah, did Lorna or Eleanor want to jump in around the one-stop border post and the ways that we might improve it for these small-scale traders?
I'm happy to just.
Sure. Oh. Sorry, go ahead, Eleanor.
Okay, I'll go quickly and then I'll leave you the floor. I think it's like really important to really understand that I guess the official, so the one-stop border post and the informal borders are really kind of interdependent. And I think there's been some work on that, but just like, what has happened with COVID has just like, put on the forefront like what the issues are. And I think like that shows even more how related they are. So, we've closed the official border. It's become really expensive for these traders to go through the official border, and we see cost increase in the informal. And I think whatever policies we're thinking about needs to really take into account that these two borders are really, or these two types of borders are related. And so if we're going to do something on the formal border, it's going to affect the informal. If we do something on the informal border, it's going to affect the formal.
Yeah, could I just follow up quickly before Lorna, you jump in, which is, so do you think that if we could reduce the amount of corruption at the formal border through more and more interventions, that the bribe level would drop at the informal border as well, just because now probably more traders would go through? Or do you think that to compensate, some of these actors would extract more from the informal border? This is something I've been thinking about.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's also something I've thought a lot, given the data is collected. I think there, as you say, there's like two kind of push happening. So on the one hand, we see when price or cost increase at the formal border, there is an increase in bribes, so therefore cost at the informal. So if we could reduce these costs, then we would see a reduction in corruption. On the other hand, like what I also see is because this like formal border has been closed, these traders can't go or don't use that formal border anymore, and they switch using informal crossings. And we do see kind of a shift of the border agents, particularly the police, to the informal border crossings that are more used. Mm-hmm. And so I think you're right that there are these two like forces at play. It does seem that you know, the reduction in cost and the reduction in corruption would outplay that shift of border agents, and so it would make sense to actually decrease, you know, the cost, or at least increase the ease for cross-border traders to cross through the formal border, and that would decrease corruption overall. But I do agree that there's these two forces that are really interesting in thinking about.
Yeah, really important. And this point about the interconnectivity is really critical, because a lot of times the formal policy, you know, just focuses on that formal border, and, you know, really keeping in mind this interconnectivity is really key. Lorna, can I invite you to comment?
Yes, I'd really like to comment on the last points that David made, as well as Eleanor right now. So the sensitization point that David made is really, really important. And it got me thinking that, you know, as we're discussing, you know, who is at the forefront of, you know, fighting corruption, one of the things that has come up in our study is that there are so many different actors involved. So not only policymakers at the end, that we have NGOs as well, such as SAUTI, we have civil society, we have trade associations as well. So what are, I think my question also, you know, our study also points to, you know, what do these trade associations, different actors, what role do they have in also ensuring safety for small scale traders? So one of the reason I bring this up is because we've talked a lot about sensitization, not only for women traders, but also for border officials as well. So it's important to see who plays a role in ensuring that traders are sensitized. Do they get this information from their trade associations? Do they get them from, you know, NGOs like SAUTI has a wonderful platform where, you know, they share information on trade policies. So it's also about thinking about, you know, when we're dealing about this fight for corruption, who are the actors that are at the forefront, and how can each of them play a significant role in making sure that, you know, we do fight corruption, especially during this pandemic time, that people are safe and they're still able to go about their day-to-day life, especially these small-scale traders. And then on the question of, you know, the informal and non-gazetted routes, it's so interesting because for the longest time, people have always been using these non-gazetted routes for one reason or another. Either the costs and tariffs associated with paying for their goods are too high, or maybe it could be a simple behavioral thing where they do not have enough, traders do not have enough information on, you know, the policies and the practices that one should follow at the border, or it could be an issue of fear. So one of the things to look at also is how can we make the non-gazetted routes safe, so that even in the event where people still have to cross to make a living, because we have small scale traders that even with the border closing, they still have to cross over so that they can sell their goods and make money. So, you know, even with that happening, how can we make the non-gazetted routes safe so that even if women are crossing, if small scale traders are crossing, they don't have to face sexual harassment. They still, you know, are kept safe in the midst of this pandemic. So I agree with Eleanor. It's a question that has been tackling a lot of us, but it's also worth thinking about if people do have to really use the non-gazetted routes, what can be done so that at least they're safe.
Yeah, that's really important. And you talked about trade associations, and I know you're also really interested in how women create their own strategies around, for example, traveling in groups, or now doing more remote trading with transporters, which is expensive. And then it's important to note that their use of bribes is actually for them a kind of corruption that solves a problem, because right now many of them still perceive, as we've been saying over and over again, the formal routes to be too difficult. So there is a policy failure there, and so they would rather pay that amount as needed to continue with their trade. So we really have to address this problem, especially in light of these crises like the pandemic, which has all these serious public health implications. So I think this question of trader associations is really important. My colleague and I have just finished a review of a lot of the work in this area, and we found that there's not a lot of research on these trader associations and how they might be able to influence the government to get some of the policy changes needed at the formal border. I know there's some really inventive things happening in Busia, and I know Sauti works very closely with them. So I'm wondering maybe if David wants to speak a little bit to that, and then we'll move to some of the questions we're getting.
Yeah, so for these women trade associations, as a matter of fact, as we're speaking right now, they're pretty much recognized by governments across the borders, and whenever there are decisions that are being made regarding cross-border trade, and especially on issues affecting women, they are always brought on board. However, though, some of the issues that these women face, and a lot of them will consider them as non-tariff barriers to crossing the border. The process for resolving them really are at such a high level that these women apparently don't get an opportunity to be part of that conversation. But ideally, it will be a great idea to bring on board these women because they understand the situations a lot more than anyone else.
Yeah, to have them more involved in policy level discussions. Thank you for that. Let's turn to questions. We have a question from Paul Haywood. I don't know, Paul, if you want to ask your question yourself, or
yeah, I'm happy to ask it. I'm sorry, I can't actually get my my video to work, so you're just going to have to put up with the hat. So the question is in regard to the border staff, who are, as you say, overwhelmingly male. But if there are some female border staff, do we have any information, do we have any evidence as to whether they also extract rent when traders pass through? Because we know from experience elsewhere, lots of research elsewhere, that in law enforcement settings, police corruption, for instance, there's a very, very strong social norm that governs how that operates and why people get engaged, often even when the returns are incredibly trivial and the potential penalties are extremely high. So I'm just wondering to what extent there's an additional dimension here that actually it wouldn't, there's all kinds of things that you need to do, but one of the key things is actually change a sort of series of culturally embedded social norm expectations of how border staff behave and how that could be done, on top of the gendered dimension, which I think has come through very, very clearly in this discussion.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'll let any of my colleagues answer it, except I would say that my guess is that you would have less sextortion, right? So the sexual harassment side might decrease if you have more women. Maybe they'll block the women from the border. Maybe they're going to still ask for a bribe, because I agree with you, just being a woman doesn't, make you less susceptible to the norms around extraction necessarily. But I am curious whether we think the sextortion, sexual harassment might decrease, and that would be important in and of itself. But I'll ask, who would like to jump into with Paul's question?
Sure, let me go first. So actually, we have women law enforcement officers, and they are equally corrupt, to be fair, but in the context of sexual harassment, obviously, that has never been, we haven't had any incidences where they stand accused, women. However, we're also aware that whenever it gets to the point of soliciting for bribes, or maybe using fear to make these women traders give out the bribes, it is the male officers that are mostly and normally used. Ideally, I guess maybe it's because of our culture, whereby apparently men can instill more fear than women, and maybe men are a lot more, I don't know, maybe respected. So I think having more police officers, or maybe security officers who are women, maybe to some extent might lead to decreasing number of sexual harassment. But in the context of corruption as it is, I think that won't change anything, because they are equally corrupt. And it's more like a system thing rather than individual decisions.
I agree. Just to add to what David said, we have had cases where it is true. So women border officials do elicit brides. Of course, there is little evidence of sexual harassment from female border officials. But one of the interesting things that my team also found, that it's easier for small scale women traders to negotiate the level amount of bride with a female official counterpart, right? So one of the things we find that because this is a lady and I am a lady, I can easily tell her, oh, Mama, I have kids, please don't, charge me 300, please charge me 100. So at that point, at least we find that it's easier for women traders to, as Eleanor was saying, this is the gaining power. They have at least a higher advantage when they're communicating with female border officials. But still, it's still a cultural thing. It's embedded. So both male and female border police officers are equally corrupt. Yeah.
And maybe just to add something on the context of corruption at the border. So ideally, we've had incidences where women themselves actually admit that they were the ones who initiated the conversation around the bribe. So what happens is, like, the security agencies, what they will do is, like, they will create an environment that leaves no option to these women traders other than proposing either to dish out a bribe to earn their freedom, or maybe other sexual favors. So I think talking about corruption at the border, it's really, both parties are actually responsible for it, and they contribute in equal measure. I think that's really important to point out as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. David, you just pointed out something I was going to say exactly. I think that we need to remember there are like two types of corruption. There's the coercive corruption and the collusive corruption. And we've been speaking a lot about the coercive corruption, but especially for like larger traders, then there is a lot of like collusive coercion, and both parties benefit from paying fewer taxes so that they can go through the border. And I think like, so I've turning more a little bit on the collusive corruption, and I guess both. I did try to collect data on whether traders specifically tried to cross the border when there was a specific border agent that was there, so a specific point in time where they knew that they could find that person and they would potentially make it easier to go through. And we do see that like traders are trying to go through, and so I don't know. Unfortunately, I don't have gender. I don't have the gender of the border agent in my data, because most of them are male actually. But it would be interesting to think about how that relationship would change if we put a new woman instead of a man, you know, there would definitely be a change at first, given it would be a new person, but then how would that relationship evolve over time?
Yeah, I think we've got some new research agenda, Eleanor. Yeah, I think this speaks to the importance of thinking about gender and also thinking about gender in the design of anti-corruption, recognizing there are these different, you know, dynamics that might emerge. Like Lorna was saying, that women who may confront women officials who live in their neighborhoods and might even have children in their same school, or, you know, whatever, they can negotiate from a different bargaining position. So I thought that was a very interesting point. Paul, I hope we answered your question. And we have another interesting question from Aleko. I don't know, Aleko, if you'd like to jump on and ask it, otherwise I can read it. Either's fine. Okay. I can read it. So Aleko is asking, any evidence suggesting that small-scale traders are sometimes used by organized crime groups to transport goods across the border, licit or illicit? That's a really good question, because there are some dynamics I think we need to look at in regards to how some small-scale traders might be actually hired by larger traders engaged in licit or illicit trade. So who would like to take that question?
Sure, yeah, so the answer to that is absolute true. Yes, that happens a lot. And there's been a lot of reports that actually these small-scale cross-border traders are the biggest non-smugglers across the border. And this goes beyond just small-scale cross-border traders only. I mean, not just women alone. We also know of people who are able differently, who are being used by organized crimes, or organized criminals ideally, to smuggle goods across the border. So yeah, that is true, that happens a lot.
David, do we know how much it happens, and whether it's associated with particular goods? Because there is a danger of stigmatizing the many small-scale traders who are really just, you know, selling food and have their own business, like the ones we saw in the video. Do you think we have adequate research and understanding of how these two are intertwined?
Oh, well, I mean, I haven't come across any research that just talks about the enormity of the whole issue, but from the conversations we have with cross-border traders, even the associations actually, they say that those are some of the issues that, some of the challenges that they face whenever even they're engaging the authorities, because sometimes they get criminalized for activities that have just been done by a few of their members. So it's true, and especially when it comes to prohibited commodities, these kind of small-scale cross-border traders are used a lot to like move those goods across the border. For instance, a commodity, when there was a little ban on the movement of maize from maybe Kenya, from Uganda to Kenya. And one that was really significant was when there was a ban on the movement of eggs from Uganda to Kenya. But then you will still find a lot of Ugandan eggs flooding the Kenyan market. And the people that were actually moving those eggs across were small-scale cross-border traders who will probably use the ungazetted routes to have those eggs moving towards Kenya.
Does anyone else want to speak to that point?
Yeah, I was just gonna actually. So I agree. I'm sure that, you know, some of these small-scale traders are used by you know, bigger organized crime groups. But I would say, like, to take kind of the other angle, like I would say that when I think it's important to kind of understand that there's different levels of like goods. So there's, you know, most of the traders that we're thinking about are just transporting kind of, you know, agriculture and completely legal goods. So even if they're going through the informal borders, they're like completely legal goods. And then the next level is like, you know, legal goods that at sometimes are not legal anymore. So like restrictions. So for example, there's sometimes restrictions on maize or restrictions on eggs or on charcoal. And then there's the next level, which is like really like illegal goods or even more, there's like human trafficking, like there's like really like a range. And I was actually surprised to like see that. I think you're right that, small scale traders obviously trade these agricultural goods and potentially also these like banned goods like eggs, charcoal, the things that are like illegal for a short period of time. But it wasn't clear to me that the exact same structure was used for those like really illegal goods or like more. And I think it's important to kind of differentiate those things because often they're put in the same like bag, and we think about like informal trade and we think about all these illegal goods, whereas most of these traders are just trading actually like agriculture commodities.
Yeah, I would agree. I think one thing that I would also add there, Jackie, is that especially when it comes to large scale goods. So even just recently, there was a ban, as David was saying, on maize imported from Uganda. And on the contrary, I believe that it's mostly the large scale, medium and large scale traders who are at the forefront of smuggling these goods. Because when you think of a small scale trader, as Eleanor has said, most of these traders are just bringing in their goods on a motorbike or on a border. So how much of these illegal goods can they actually bring, unless they're tiny sets of illegal or banned goods? That in terms of people who make profits and maybe who are at the forefront of smuggling large scale illegal goods, I would definitely point out to looking at middle and large scale traders. As well as looking at the role of police officers, right? So police officers are also at the forefront of this, because it's not uncommon to see that police officers have also allowed large trucks to bring illegal goods in the middle of the night when there are no officials at all at the border. And that's how most of these goods are still flooding the market, as David has said, even after ban.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to make those distinctions like Eleanor is saying. And we do have this large scale illicit, smuggling, and often that sort of high level corruption, as we see in a number of, interesting, research by people like Titica and others, that those are often politicians, very powerful people who are connected to police and to customs. And, you have to wonder if they're setting the norms, right, that then become very just very ubiquitous. What that speaks to, Eleanor, is also this, not only do we need to look at the formal, informal, but we need to maybe look at how these different levels of corruption interact with each other. So if customs officials are getting the signal from high level politicians and others that, this is a system of how it works and legitimizing it, then that, that is how they're also behaving towards these small scale traders, much to their detriment and the detriment of their communities. Because I just want to really wrap up by saying these small scale traders are really, really important. All the evidence suggests that they support communities and families and children. And we see that, like in so many other cases, they are extremely vulnerable to corruption, harassment, not being visible in policy and programs, which is how the One Stop Border Post started, and then it had to sort of retrofit thinking about these small scale traders. And also now with our pandemic, that we see that they are, again, when they're not being considered, we can amplify public health and other serious problems. And so I think we need to have a lot more attention on this going forward. And with that, I really want to thank everyone who joined us today, and especially our panelists. And I really would encourage everyone who's interested in these issues to really take a look at Saute's work. It's really phenomenal. Take a look at their website. Eleanor, I would love if you have just a quick second to put a link to your paper, which is really fantastic. And we have a working paper, which we hope you'll find interesting, and we'll be continuing to publish through the Global Integrity Anti-Corruption Evidence Program. So feel free to be in touch with all of us. And thank you so much for joining and for this vibrant conversation and your questions.